So we're currently working on. Should I step on this? Okay. All right. No. I'm not that tall. I'm not that tall. I'm not that tall. I'm not tall.
You look even better.
Thank you, Mr. President. One of the most exciting things we're working on, using the tools that Sam and Masa are providing, is a cancer vaccine. It's very interesting. It turns out, I'll be quick, all of our cancers, cancer tumors, little fragments of those tumors float around in your blood. So you can do early cancer detection. If you can do using you can do early cancer detection with a blood test, and using AI to look at the blood test, you can find the cancers that are actually seriously threatening the person. So we can, again, cancer diagnosis using AI has the promise of just being a simple blood test. Then beyond that, once we gene sequence that cancer tumor, you can then vaccinate the person, design a vaccine for every individual person to vaccinate them against that cancer. And you can make that vaccine, that mRNA vaccine, you can make that robotically, again using AI, in about 48 hours. So imagine early cancer detection, the development of a cancer vaccine for your particular cancer aimed at you, and have that vaccine available in 48 hours. This is the promise of AI and the promise of the future.
Great, thanks.
The addition of artificial intelligence and spinning it as a way to apply mRNA vaccine technology is somewhat novel, but business plan for Moderna. So what Larry is reciting is the original Moderna business plan, which failed. Moderna was about to go bankrupt in trying to develop cancer vaccines and apply their technology for that purpose, before it functionally got rescued by the U.S. government and Tony Fauci and pushed forward as the brave new technology for the COVID-19 response. That was, we've lived through that for the last 4 years. So what is Larry talking about here? And it's important to remember that he is a staunch advocate for both this mRNA vaccine technology. He believes there's separate clips in which he's talking about how it's completely safe and it's been basically a miracle during COVID. So that's his frame of reference. He's also deeply committed to transhuman technology. So that's where he's coming from. A fascinating wrinkle in this is that his senior biologics expert, his expert in biostatistics, a gentleman by the name of Bill Dumichel, was in January 2021 collaborating with people at the FDA in the Office of the Commissioner and the Office of the Chief Scientist to analyze the data safety signals that were coming out of the trials and initial deployment of the mRNA vaccines. And it was that team that originally detected the myocarditis signal. Now, that was then denied by the CDC, denied by the FDA. They notified the data team in Israel, the same group of people, including Bill Dumichel, chief biostatistician for Oracle, and notified the Israelis, because at the time the Israelis were believed to have the best database relating to the safety and effectiveness of these vaccines, this vaccine platform, and notified them of what had been detected using non-parametric methods, that's a fancy word for advanced statistical methods, and that had been applied by this team. The Israelis then queried their database, confirmed that they were seeing the myocarditis signal, informed the CDC of their findings, and that's when the CDC and the FDA finally started coming around and talking about myocarditis. Key point here is that Oracle's chief biostatistician was well aware of the risks associated with the mRNA vaccine, particularly the myocarditis risk, but others also.
Mm-hmm.
And this has been denied by the CEO, Larry. So that's where he's coming from. He's coming from a strong endorsement. I don't know if he has a financial conflict of interest, if he's a major investor in Moderna or whatever, but I certainly think that's something that bears looking into, is why is he such a staunch advocate for this technology platform when it's not really in his business space? Be that as it may, what he's talking about, picking up circulating peripheral blood cancer cells, has been in the literature for at least 20 years. It's a challenge to be able to capture those cells and then do single cell sequencing, which is basically what he's talking about. That's not cheap. It's technologically challenging, and it's outside of his core competence, by the way. That has nothing to do with artificial intelligence. Then we get into, okay, now you've sequenced these circulating cells. And by the way, only a subset of cancers are associated with these circulating peripheral blood cancer cells. It's not all cancer.
Okay.
So it's a subset. And sequencing those and then trying to discern what makes them different genetically, what makes them unique, is something that's been ongoing for decades. Really, for my entire career, that's been a major emphasis of many groups, because it's kind of the holy grail. If you could do this, if you could then identify things that were different that could be antigenically used in a vaccine. And there's lots of different ways to advance those vaccines. People have been trying to develop cancer vaccines using all kinds of platforms, including standard gene therapy technology, for decades. So that hasn't turned out to work so good in either humans or animals. Why not? Because the real problem is not identifying potential novel antigens associated with cancer cells. That's old school. It's been done for years. The real problem is that cancer exists in us. It gets a foothold when it evolves under the pressure of your immune system to be able to escape your immune system. I just noticed there's a Nature Medicine paper out today that talks about how cancer cells basically poison the immune system. The problem is that these many different types of cancers evolve to be able to evade immune surveillance, host immune surveillance, your body's ability to suppress them. It's a fundamental principle in oncology that cancers are arising continuously in all of us. You and I, being of one of the two genders that happens to have a prostate, it's a clinical saw in pathology, which is the world I come from, that if males live long enough, they will die with prostate cancer, even if they don't die of prostate cancer. Cancers are occurring all the time in our bodies, and the thing that keeps them in check is our immune system.
Right.
And the real problem is that we don't understand very well how that works. We've had some advances in coming up with biologics in particular that help overcome this immune evasion, but we don't really understand it because it's enormously complex. And by the way, it's a good news thing that humans are outbred, unlike inbred mice, and we have a very diverse set of genes and molecules that are responsible for determining what antigens get recognized and how. It's called our major histocompatibility complex, and there's various proteases also associated with it. So that means that you can't make any easy prediction that what works for you is going to work for me. You can't come up with a universal cancer vaccine, which is something that Larry seems to have said, but maybe I'm misinterpreting that. But this idea of personalized cancer vaccines, frankly, if he came to me and said, Dr. Malone, I'm going to pay you an exorbitant fee like I pay all my other consultants, and I want you to tell me what we should spend our time with our fancy new artificial intelligence Stargate tool in order to crack the problem of cancer. I wouldn't say, hey, why don't you try to do what everybody else has been doing for the last 30 years? I would say, why don't you apply your artificial intelligence to trying to understand why and how cancers evolve to escape immune surveillance. That's where we could really use the artificial intelligence. So what this strikes me as is somebody who really doesn't know what he's talking about. That's pretty clear to me and probably every cancer biologist that saw this clip. And to have this guy lecturing at me with his hands just was a little bit over the top. As I said, I threw up in my throat a little bit listening to this. What we ought to do is get real about what can be done. I don't know who's been coaching Larry and his buddies. It sounds like a pitch that, in my experience, would not survive scrutiny for 5 minutes at any of the venture capital firms I've ever pitched to. It's naive, it's overly simplistic, and it's jingoistic. They're taking a bunch of terms that are really sexy, stringing them together, and spinning them to the public. Personally, I find that pretty offensive. I find it kind of abusive. It's not even at the level of psychological warfare. This is just, a crude marketing push using buzzwords. And I'm sorry to say this. Somebody was just advising me, don't get on the bad side of Mr. Trump. He'll kick you out and that'll be that. But I honor and respect that President Trump is fully committed to helping the United States become a global leader, if not the global leader, instead of the CCP, in artificial intelligence. Bully for him. That's fantastic. Is this the best use of $500 billion? You know what they say in DC, $500 billion here, $500 billion there, and pretty soon you're talking about real money. This is a substantial sum. And is this the best way to use it? If we take this into Maha space, this is still focusing on treating disease. And we could take a large fraction, if not all of that money, and invest it in promoting health and advocating for healthy lifestyles, healthy eating habits, et cetera, and things that can make more healthy foods available to the general public and probably have a bigger impact on cancer incidence and survivability and overall disease than we would by trying to piggyback on top of a sexy new AI tool that's going to cost us big money, moonshot kind of money. And that's where I come down on this is, Larry, sometimes I get lectured that I'm outside of my lane. Well, in this case, Larry's outside of his lane. He doesn't seem to know what he's talking about. And I think that as I look at these clips, what comes to me is that these guys were in the middle of presenting this new initiative that the president is strongly endorsing, and rightfully so. It would be great if the United States had world-class or world-leading capabilities in artificial intelligence. It's almost essential for defense purposes, if nothing else, that we have that capability. But then they were in a position, what it strikes me is that somebody said, well, you got to find some way to make this accessible to the common man, to express to the common man how this fancy new gadget is going to make his life better, his or her life better. And so they said, oh, I know, cancer. Everybody's afraid of cancer. Right. And we could come up with a little logic of how we could make this work for cancer. But that is absolutely not the primary purpose that's going on here. It's a potential spin-off application, just like Tang orange juice and space food sticks were spin-off applications from the Moonshot program. But it is not the primary purpose, and I think it's a little duplicitous, underhanded, not transparent to spin this and pitch it as a way to solve the cancer problem. It's really intended for much larger issues, and I'm personally a little bit offended that this data guy and these Silicon Valley moguls and this bank are going to come in and act like they really know what's going on when they clearly are. They could have come up with 20, 30, 40 ideas that were better than this one. It also smacks of them kind of playing Donald Trump because they're hitting hot buttons that he personally is invested in. He's invested in the idea of Operation Warp Speed. He was invested in the success of the mRNA technology. He still thinks that the mRNA products were safe and effective, except maybe they were overdosed in children. And so it feels to me like he was being pitched in a way that really wasn't, very respectful.
Jim O'Neill frames it as free market innovation, but it would just be a field day for crony capitalism at the end of the day. And also, I forgot to add one of the other, some of the figures that have inspired, that he's cited as inspiring his views on eliminating efficacy testing, say that the efficacy data should be tested on patients after these drugs are administered to them through biosurveillance, including through digital wearables, and that big pharmaceutical companies, the producers of those products, should be given access to the data so that they can jack up the price, depending on how quote unquote effective the drug is based on this data. And it's also a way to surveil what's going on inside people's bodies, which is eerily reminiscent of things said by people like Yuval Noah Harari, who's, affiliated with the World Economic Forum, talking about the utility, how the next frontier of mass surveillance is to surveil what's going on inside people's bodies. And it's quite disturbing that Palantir has now taken over major functions of HHS, including at the CDC, and other aspects of agency functions. And because of O'Neill's deep ties to both Palantir and Peter Thiel, it's likely that he'll push for a deepening of those ties. And Palantir is really the engine that the mass surveillance state runs on. It's a contractor to every single U.S. intelligence agency, all 18 of them, as well as HHS. And it's currently operating programs within HHS that are trying to use Americans' healthcare data to try and predict when people will get sick before they show symptoms. And one of their programs with the CDC has the potential to push for the declaration of a next pandemic before anyone shows symptoms at all, and pushing for this idea that we don't have to, if in the next pandemic, we don't have to do a blanket lockdown, but based on people's healthcare data, we can decide to lock down specific cities or specific communities based on data they assess from the wastewater and things like that before people show any symptoms. But these are AI algorithms making these decisions. They are not 100% accurate. So under this paradigm, you have the potential for an algorithm that's 70 or 60% accurate to say that this city needs to be locked down based on this data, with really no transparency and no way to fight back, with major implications for the local economy and the freedom of movement for people living there, among other things. And some of the people, again, that are sort of behind Jim O'Neill and in his viewpoints, push for segmenting populations based on this data. So basically, certain populations should be given certain types of drugs, and this is quite a complicated thing when you consider that a lot of Palantir's AI specifically is known to have a very extreme racial bias, and was a major cause for concern when Palantir's Tiberius program was used as part of Operation Warp Speed to decide which populations to vaccinate with the experimental mRNA injections first. And of course, they picked mostly minority communities. So this sort of opens the door to experiment a lot of these drugs that are going to be pushed through in this deregulated paradigm on minorities, which is very, very, very unsettling. When you consider the fact that Larry Ellison, the CEO of Oracle, was recently platformed at the White House to promote, among other things, AI-generated, personalized cancer vaccines using mRNA. He recently said that this type of AI surveillance system would force citizens to be on their best behavior at all times, and is basically a nod to the whole concept of a panopticon, which was originally a prison design I think first, posited in the 19th century or so. And the idea of it was that prisoners would always be on their best behavior because they were always under the watch of a guard, but they couldn't necessarily, because of how the windows were designed in the guard tower, see if they were being watched or not. But feeling that they were being watched at any given moment would induce obedience. And this is the type of tactic that an authoritarian society would employ, not something that
Right.
is not a society that's trying to enshrine individual liberty and freedom, which I think a lot of people that voted for Trump were hoping to enshrine that. But frankly, I think a lot of the advancement of, Palantir in particular, and what it's attempting to do with its various contracts in the U.S. government is really a bipartisan thing. Their contracts have expanded and advanced with every successive administration since they were created. Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden, and likely to do so again, considering a lot of the Palantir adjacent figures. That are in the Trump administration. David Sachs, for example, the crypto AI czar, is a big investor in Palantir. Joe Lonsdale, another Palantir co-founder, has been a very vocal supporter of the president and funded his campaign this cycle. And of course, Peter Thiel's connection to people like J.D. Vance, who worked at Mithril Capital, which of course is a major investor in Palantir. A lot of this does need to be discussed. And I think if people are concerned about these types of paradigms, they should push for a policy rejection of these things. Even if they like a particular person that has these, what I would argue are conflicts of interest, if you can, as you said earlier, like other things they do or say, and not necessarily like this. And I think, if people are concerned about civil liberty and not turning into some sort of totalitarian hellhole where individual liberty is a distant memory, this type of predictive paradigm needs to be rejected, whether it's about national security or health security. I think it's quite clear that a lot of the big tech oligarchs feel like this is going to be a golden age for them specifically. I think it was pretty telling that at the recent inauguration, a lot of them had front row seats, including those that had been very antagonistic to Trump in previous years, like Jeff Bezos in particular, who owns the Washington Post, which was one of the most vocal mainstream media outlets that was very vocally against Trump. So the fact that they're sort of being welcomed back with open arms is quite interesting. But I think, as I've argued for a few years in my work, Silicon Valley and the national security state have essentially fused. You could argue that these big tech oligarchs have more influence over our government than any elected politician because of how dependent the government is on them for their services, whether that's Amazon Web Services, Microsoft, or any of these other companies that are becoming increasingly entangled with the US government, like Palantir that I mentioned earlier. A lot of the essential functions of the government are dependent on these big tech companies now. And they, are trying to, I think, push for a new era of quote unquote innovation and things like AI and things like that, but that would necessarily necessitate greater AI adoption. And so, some of these entities that developed the AI roadmap for the United States, like the National Security Commission on AI, was saying in 2019 that, in-person shopping needs to be eliminated. Facial recognition needs to be more widespread on American streets. Basically, we have to forcibly expand the user base for all of this AI technology. And the best way to do that is through government policy. And so a lot of these announcements, for example, with Stargate and their AI data centers, the teaming up of, OpenAI now becoming a major government contractor, and, Sam Altman saying we need to rewrite the social contract as a consequence of the impacts AI will have on society, and things of that nature. And how Palantir is basically becoming one of the AI engines on which, society, not just the public sector, but also a lot of the private sector is now running. A lot of these oligarchs have outsized influence on our world, and maybe Bill Gates isn't chairman of Microsoft anymore, but he certainly has a lot of influence in the big tech scene. He's a major investor in a lot of infrastructure companies through his various investment firms, and a lot of those investments, of course, have been made in biotechnology. He made a massive amount of money off of vaccines, particularly in the COVID era. The US government has never stopped funding one of his brain children, Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance. We give them billions and billions of dollars and have ever since they were created. And they're one of the biggest funders of the World Health Organization, for example. So even though Trump exited from the WHO, we are still funding, organizations that partner with the WHO and fund the WHO. Bill Gates funds the WHO, I'm pretty sure, directly as an individual through his foundation.
Yes,
and
he
so
does,
sort
yeah.
of cozying up to him. Yeah. So I think cozying up to him, is problematic in a lot of ways. And the fact that he, in particular, was so enthusiastic after his conversation with Trump about how there would be some sort of acceleration of vaccine innovation, similar to what happened in 2020, which is presumably a reference to Operation Warp Speed and the emergency use authorization paradigm. I would argue that seems to be Bill Gates signaling that there's enthusiasm on the part of the current administration to allow a lot of these mRNA products onto the market. But as we knew during COVID, and also as is still apparent, a lot of these mRNA products under the current regulatory paradigm cannot even make it through animal trials. So there would have to be a great reduction in the rigor of clinical testing, which is already arguably ridden with conflicts of interest, depending on the contractor doing that testing. And you could argue that some of those tests aren't rigorous enough, or there's also a revolving door with, those agencies and big pharma, things like that. I think, people need to be very concerned about mRNA technology, and that we shouldn't necessarily be hoping that the government, even with this administration, will save us from it. I think the best we can probably, or something we can probably push for and hopefully get, is that products with mRNA in them, whether that's livestock, meat from livestock injected with mRNA, or other products that have mRNA, are labeled as containing genetic material so people can make informed consent. But I think it's pretty clear that this administration plans to allow those products onto the market, and not to really push for them to be removed, or to have them undergo more rigorous testing. It seems to be quite the opposite. And this is actually, unfortunately, consistent with things that happened with Trump's first term. Not necessarily, well, of course it happened with pharmaceuticals under the guise of COVID-19, but also the biotech industry was dramatically deregulated in agriculture, and genetic modified organisms had it was a huge market swing in the upwards direction for them under Trump. And actually a lot of organic farmer associations and small farmer associations sued the first Trump administration because of that extreme deregulation of GMOs in the food supply. So, it seems like, at least as far as President Trump is concerned, he doesn't see these, genetically engineered products, whether in the food supply or in the healthcare system, as concerning. And I think, people have sort of tried to explain away his support for the vaccines produced in Operation Warp Speed, and say he doesn't necessarily feel that way. But I think we should pay attention to his own words. And he's continued to sort of, praise it as a great accomplishment. And hasn't really said anything about mRNA needs to be studied, or we're not sure about this. It seems like he's all on board, as of course are the big business leaders in big pharma, which I know Max Jones a month or two ago was on your show to talk about the issue of big pharma and patent cliffs. Really, the only way big pharma can stay alive and continue to expand its profits, as it is wont to do, is to get biotech deregulated so it can flood the product with markets that never have to necessarily go generic and mean that loss of profit, for big pharma, because they'll be in a different category than a lot of existing drugs that are exclusive to a pharmaceutical company and then later go generic. And that creates a big profit dip for these firms. But a lot of these biotechnology things won't be subject to that. And because they're sort of running out of conventional products to market and produce that can make it through regulation. This has been the big push, and they're joined in doing so through a lot of joint ventures with some of the big tech firms, like GlaxoSmithKline, for example, has a joint venture with Google, and there's a lot of these that have been popping up over the years. So, if you have Silicon Valley having an outside influence on this administration, that could very possibly be a motivator here as well. And a lot of the big venture capital firms that are responsible for the rise of the big Silicon Valley behemoths or have been produced from them are among the biggest investors in the biotechnology industry. And so I think, people that are concerned about this technology need to be very focused on how these policy agendas progress, and try and do all we can to have informed consent about what products contain them, so that if you wish not to consume them, you can do so effectively.
Brass Check TV, free to you, not free to us. We've got a server bill, we've got an email software bill, we've got a tech helper bill, and that happens every month. So to everybody that is supporting us financially, that's paying for their subscription in one way or another, we really appreciate it. If you're not, consider doing so. Everybody's got money for the newspaper and the cable bill and all that. Do you have money for media that's actually serving you? That's really the issue here. And when you help us, it allows us to get this information out to the world. So thanks to all our supporters, and if you're not a supporter already, please consider becoming one.